may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to thee, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So this is a pithy reading. It's got lots of stuff in it. What's most curious for me about this one is the word righteousness, which comes at the end. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. I thought they were the bad guys. Aren't we always hearing about what they're not doing right? And here Matthew's using them as a measure of how righteous we have to be. Isn't that pretty low? So it doesn't take much? No. And you're smiling for good reason. That's not what it means. Most of the scribes and Pharisees were following exactly what their orders of faith told them, which was to study the scripture and then live out the scripture. And the Hebrew Testament is sure about absolutely one thing. You are to love your neighbor as yourself, and you are to do good works. That hasn't changed from the beginning of the Ten Commandments to right now, is that we have to be good people. And to be integrated in our faith means that what the law says is congruent with what you are doing. So your good works are a reflection on the faith and the position that you have. So if most of the scribes are doing a really good job of what they're supposed to be doing, a scribe is one who takes the minutes, but is also one who studies the word. And the Pharisees are the higher people that organize the religion within the church. So this would be like our altar guild and like our adult study class or even the Christian education class. They're supposed to know what they're doing. It's the ones who aren't following, they're being hypocritical, that Jesus gets upset with. And it's not all the scribes and not all the Pharisees. But then the second troubling thing is that there's this kind of pecking order in heaven. Who is troubled by that? I don't want a pecking order in heaven. The least in the kingdom of heaven and the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, we have to be more studious and more integrated than the Pharisees, which is a high bar, in order to be of higher status in heaven. Well, don't worry about that. Hyperbole was part of the Hebrew way of teaching the law and the prophets. So hyperbole is to be taken as an example of what we're to strive for. So if we strive with all our might, we're going to ask God to help us, right? We don't do it all by ourselves. So we become higher only by making ourselves lower. And that's also very much what the Hebrew Testament teaches us. And the New Testament, Jesus says, is flowing right from that. We are not separating off from Mother Church or from the Hebrew way of living or from the scripture. We are following in the ancestors' vision of what's a just world and what is a holy world by being righteous. Most of us grew up knowing what self-righteous was, right? We were always told, don't be self-righteous. We don't use the word righteous very often. Do you hear that said very often? I don't hear it much. To be righteous is to be congruent, to have everything line up inside your heart and your brain so that your mouth isn't saying something you don't mean, and you have a good attitude about who you are and that God created you to have a calling and to do what God created you to do, which is follow God. God will teach you. All of this strata is an example of our effort. That if we have great effort in going to God and asking for help, I'm not sure what you want me to do here. Things like that. Please help me to do this. Please help me to do that. If we call in for help, we're living into our heritage of our faith. So, leave that one for a minute and go back to the salt and the light. It's been interesting this week to work with this a little bit. I discovered that salt does lose its taste if you're poor. In the Mediterranean area, the Middle East, salt was a commodity that was very valuable. They even used salt blocks as money in the Mesopotamian area. So if you're wealthy, you have plenty of salt in your little salt shakers, and food tastes better, right, with your salt? If you're poor, you stretch out your salt by adding sand to the salt. So the little bit of salt you have goes a longer way. The more you dilute your salt with sand, it loses its potency. So the poorest of the poor would have heard this and known exactly what Jesus is talking about. If saltiness has lost its taste, why bother? Don't shake sand over your food as the poor do. So if we have salt in us, which we do, like I told the kids, we have the same saline solution running around in our cells as the ocean does. And it's no wonder we're drawn to the beach. Like attracts like. As light attracts light. If we are the light, and Jesus is saying these in the present tense, you are the salt of the earth. They haven't taken confirmation class, they haven't learned how you're supposed to be a Christian. They've just come to listen to Jesus. He's doing this Sermon on the Mount. They are the salt of the earth. You already are because you're listening to Jesus. That's all it takes. Yeah. And you are the light of the world. Try this. If you're sitting next to a neighbor, look into your neighbor's eyes, and you will see a light flickering in their eyes because our eyes reflect the lights that are in the room. No matter where you are in this room, you will have light sparkling in your eyes. And anybody who's in love with someone loves that sparkle. And sometimes we don't notice it, but it's there all the time. We think it's just because we love that person. But the sparkle's always there. And because we have electricity running through our system, our nervous system is an electrical system, we all have this picture that the brain is the head of it, right? Instead of the nerves down through the body. And that's not correct. It's the heart that is the center of this system. The heart has these synapses and energy and nerves that send out this incredible glow, that we actually have light that is shining through us as all these nerves send messages and ideas and habits into our hands and into our voice and into our speech. So we are light, and light attracts light. Jesus is talking to the light that is already in us, and that light wakes up and responds to the truth in a way that only hearing what it is you're yearning to hear is what you are told. And most of us have not had a consistency with that people told us things that weren't congruent with the love of God, that all are welcome, that everyone is raised up, that there's no judgments here. Jesus was all about inclusion, light, and a lot of salt. And was he righteous?